Welcome to the Beyond the Shelf series. I'm delighted to have our speaker today, Themrise Khan, who has a long history with Aga Khan University, as well as the wider development sector. Now, as I think you see a bunch of familiar faces here, and online I saw familiar names, so many of you know that this series is really designed to get us to think about some things, get us to argue about some things. We may say things, we may have speakers who say things that are controversial, that people disagree with, and that's fine. What we want is a healthy, robust conversation. We may not have answers at the end of it, but we certainly should be thinking critically about these topics that our speakers raise. And I think Themrise is a very good example of someone who has worked deeply in an area, understands it very well, very profoundly, has a personal experience in it, practical experience, and has stepped back and critically reflected on her own role, on the role of others, and has come up with a book which is, if you haven't read it, you should. It's got a provocative title, but I think it's an excellent book. It's an excellent contribution to the field. Now, it reminded me, one of my mentors, Professor Paul Silito, worked in development, is a real champion for anthropological involvement in development, says that anthropologists should be involved in development, we should participate in it. He was employed by the Department for International Development in the UK to go into a valley in Papua New Guinea, Highland Papua New Guinea, the Wola Valleys, to try and find areas where they could introduce wage opportunities for the local people. So Paul went to the valley, and he came back after, I can't remember how much time it was, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and said, actually, no, they have no poverty there now. If you introduce wage opportunities, you will be introducing poverty. You will be damaging this community's cohesion. You will be damaging this community's life standards by introducing the kind of wage labor opportunities that you are framing development around. Paul told me he never got asked back by that particular part of DFID. He's done other development work for others, but one of the things that he has always been saying is sometimes development isn't good for people. Sometimes development is actually bad for people. And so an anthropologist being involved in development does not mean be a mouthpiece for the funder. It means think about the impact on local people. And I think nobody encapsulates that better than our current speaker. So Themrise, without further ado, I'm going to invite you up to speak for about 25, 30 minutes and really give us this hard argument, this uncomfortable argument, where people like me will squirm a bit, and then we will hopefully have a very helpful, productive conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, very, very much for the invitation to come and speak here today. And yes, I don't have a very long history with AKU, but I do have a history with AKU. Longer history with the Aga Khan Foundation, because that's where I started my career, ironically enough. So, Assalamu alaikum, thank you all for coming in person and those of you online. I'm going to be Urdu English in both because that's just how comfortable I feel speaking in Pakistan at least. Spoken so much in English, you know, in different forums, one feels you miss your own language sometimes. So, थोड़ा सा अपने बारे में मैं बता दूं, मैंने कोई तकरीबन 30 साल हो गए अपना करियर इंटरनेशनल डेवलपमेंट में शुरू किया था। एक अदारा है कराची में शिरकत के नाम से, which is शिरकत Women's Resource Center. So I don't know if all of you heard about it. It's one of the leading women's rights organization with a very long history of some of the most active women's rights, human rights defenders working in Pakistan from the 70s and 80s onwards. So I started off with them as an intern. 18 साल की थी, स्कूल से ही निकली थी, और I just started working with them, cutting newspaper clippings or pasting them in a scrapbook. उस ज़माने में अखबारों काफी रिवाज था, और हम सारे जो women related news items आते थे वो हम काट के मैं एक scrapbook glue करके उनकी लाइब्रेरी के लिए करती थी। आहिस्ता आहिस्ता वहाँ से उन्होंने मुझे छोटे छोटे और कामों में इन्वॉल्व कर दिया। एक बहुत बड़ी साउथ एशिया बेस्ड कॉन्फ्रेंस कर रहे थे ऑन वुमेन्स राइट्स, वुमेन्स लीगल राइट्स इन इस्लाम, WLUML का था। उसमें इन्वॉल्व किया. एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन का काम सारा था, but that's what got me involved in the whole idea of a development sector. That was the first time I came across something known as a donor. मुझे तो पता भी नहीं था कि donors होते कौन हैं. I didn't even know what an NGO was. But that's the first time I got introduced because उनके काफी foreign donors बाहर से आके उनके projects fund करते थे, and that's how I got involved in the sector in Pakistan. और बाहर कनाडा से जाके मैंने डेवलपमेंट स्टडीज में अंडरग्रेजुएट करके मैं वापस पाकिस्तान आ गई. और my first ever job was with AKF कराची. उनका एक प्रोजेक्ट था कराची में PNG रिसोर्स सेंटर, साका सलाउद्दीन चलाती थी. तो वहाँ मुझे नौकरी मिल गई वापस आके. And after that, it was no looking back. And traveled the length and breadth of Pakistan, doing projects and programs. और उसके बारे में थोड़ा आगे जाके बात करूँगी. But it was a world I didn't know existed in Pakistan. In one way, it was fascinating because मुझे मौका मिला उन communities में जाने में और उन लोगों के साथ मिलने जुलने में, otherwise मुझे कभी मौका ना मिलता. दूसरा साइड उसका ये था कि it was such a far removed world from reality कि उसको reconcile करना भी it was very difficult. कि हम जाते थे गांव में projects लेके, तो एक capacity building का project था जिसमें हम training देते थे quote unquote गांव के लोगों को कि आप फाइनेंशियल मैनेजमेंट कैसे कर सकते हैं, या आप अपना एक जो कम्युनिटी इदारा है उसको कैसे शुरू कर सकते हैं, उसकी मैनेजमेंट कैसे कर सकते हैं. टू प्रोजेक्ट्स जो कह रहे थे कि वुमेन्स एम्पावरमेंट क्या चीज होती है, औरतों को हम किस तरह से, स्कूल टीचर्स को हम कैसे मजीद ट्रेन कर सकते हैं कि वो गांव के जो गवर्नमेंट स्कूल्स हैं उनमें पढ़ा सके. तो इंटरेस्टिंग तो बहुत था, बहुत सीखा, बट एजेंडा जो था was not fitting with Pakistan's own development. वो एक sort of force fit था जो बाहर वाले donors, और उस वक्त तक मुझे donors की काफी जान पहचान हो गई थी. Americans थे, British थे, mostly Americans and British, but Americans, British, Australians, Europeans, Canadians, everybody wanted to do something different with the same community. और हम भी ले जाते थे बड़े शौक से. वर्ल्ड बैंक से लोग टीम आती थी, हम खूब प्लानिंग तैयारी करके टीम को जो फॉरेनर्स होते थे उनको ले जाते थे गांव में बड़ा उनका एक सफारिया हुआ करता था, फूलों के हार, रोज पेटल्स, खाना पीना, और फिर हम प्रेजेंट करते थे कि जी इस गांव के हेड ये हैं और हम ये ट्रेनिंग दी है और अब उनके गांव को देखें. तो एक तरह से एक मॉडल्स हमारे बन रहे, मॉडल विलेजेस, मॉडल प्रोजेक्ट्स. तो ये करते करते इवेंचुअली कुछ साल गुजर गए. उस वक्त तो इतना अंदाजा नहीं हुआ मुझे कि how damaging this was as a process to our own people. उस वक्त I was young, I was learning, it was all very fascinating, interesting. बहुत नए लोगों से इंटरेक्शन हुई. मगर आहिस्ता आहिस्ता as time wore on, फिर मैं रिसर्च और इवैल्यूएशन में चली गई. तो more high level policy work, गवर्नमेंट डिपार्टमेंट्स के साथ, गवर्नमेंट के साथ बहुत काम किया, फेडरल गवर्नमेंट के साथ बहुत काम किया, पॉलिसी मेकिंग में, एक्शन रिसर्च में, प्रोग्राम एवेल्युएशन में, डोनर्स के साथ डायरेक्टली काम किया. तो लर्निंग जो चलती रही, मगर एक पॉइंट आया जब अंदाजा हुआ कि कुछ मूव नहीं हो रहा, पाकिस्तान मूव नहीं हो रहा, पॉलिटिकली और सोशली तो मूव हो रहा है मगर डेवलपमेंट सेक्टर कहीं जा नहीं रहा. तो वो फिर एक डाउट जहन में निकल आई. उसके बाद ये था कि हमारी इंटरेक्शन बहुत इंटरनेशनल इंडिविजुअल्स के साथ होती थी जो डोनर्स को रिप्रेजेंट करते थे. तो बाहर से कंसल्टेंट्स आते थे, अमेरिकन्स, ब्रिटिश, यूरोपियंस, कैनेडियंस, उनके साथ काम करना पड़ता था. और उनका आउटलुक पाकिस्तान के बारे में बहुत एक अजीब सा था. वो कल्चरल मिसअंडरस्टैंडिंग्स भी होते थे, एक इम्पोज्ड अंडरस्टैंडिंग होती थी कि हम तो ये प्रोग्राम को फंड कर रही है हमारी गवर्नमेंट, दिस इज हाउ वी वांट इट डन एंड दिस इज हाउ वी आर गोइंग टू डू इट, एंड वी वुड डू इट. जो वो हमें कहते थे हम करते थे बिकॉज़ द मनी वाज कमिंग फ्रॉम देम. मगर वही बात थी कि चेंज नहीं आ रहा था पाकिस्तान में. मैंने जेंडर पे और वुमेन्स इश्यूज पे बहुत काम किया, बहुत साल. जेल्स में गई, औरतों के जेल्स में गई, पुलिस स्टेशंस में गई, गांव में गई, ट्रेड यूनियंस फॉर्म करने की कोशिश की. एक एक चीज पे पैसा आ रहा था बट नथिंग वाज मूविंग in Pakistan in these areas. चीजें in fact पीछे जा रही थी. फिर मुशर्रफ का दौर आया, लोगों ने कहा नहीं बहुत तब्दीलियां आ रही हैं. There was a lot of money coming in after 9/11. तो इस्लामाबाद में भी 4-5 साल रही. वहां पे तो एक मतलब आप समझ लीजिए मतलब मेला लगा हुआ था इंटरनेशनल डोनर्स का. फिर 2005 का अर्थक्वेक जो कश्मीर में हुआ, उसके बाद से बहुत ह्यूमैनिटेरियन एजेंसीज आ गई पाकिस्तान में, उन्होंने डेरा जमा लिया. तो इस्लामाबाद में तो लुट मची हुई थी एक तरह से. एंड इस्लामाबाद को वैसे भी शहर कहते हैं इज आउट ऑफ पाकिस्तान, सो द डोनर सेक्टर इन पाकिस्तान वाज इवन फर्दर आउट. मैं AKF को भी इसमें इंक्लूड कर रही हूँ. AKF वाज नो डिफरेंट बिकॉज़ AKF एक तरह से इंटरनेशनल इदारा था, तो उनका काम भी जो AKRSP नॉटविथस्टैंडिंग जिसपे इज आई थिंक अ स्टैंड अलोन, बट AKF के दूसरे प्रोजेक्ट्स जो पाकिस्तान में चल रहे थे खासतौर पे एजुकेशन में IED ने बहुत काम किया. तो I'm including them in the same idea कि एक तरह से there was a disconnect between what was happening in Pakistan on the ground, what was needed and what was being brought in. So after a while it just got a bit much because वो आप इतने साल एक सेक्टर में आप काम करते हैं and you want to passionately change your country for the better, but you see it's not happening and you get bogged down in things like एक होता था LFA log frame analysis और RBM results based analysis. घंटों हफ्तों गुजर जाते थे हमारे ये RBMs और LFA भर भर के. ये बेसिकली मैट्रिक्स थे जो सीधा कैनेडियन सीधा जो उनको तो उनका तो फेवरेट टॉय था, तो कि ये भर के हमें भेजो फिर हमें पता चलेगा कि क्या तुम लोग कर रहे हो हमारे पैसों के साथ. एंड इट वाज अ नाइटमेयर. और मैं बहुत सारे प्रोजेक्ट और प्रोग्राम इवैल्यूएशंस में मैंने काम किया है एज द नेशनल कंसल्टेंट. तो होता ये था कि बाहर की कोई फर्म जो थी वो आती थी करती थी इवैल्यूएशन में, नेशनल कंसल्टेंट जो एक तरह से हैव टू से ग्लोरीफाइड ट्रांसलेटर बन के मुझे हायर करते थे, तो मैं उनके साथ चली जाती थी. एंड आइडियली वो ये था कि आई वाज सपोज्ड टू गिव द पाकिस्तान पर्सपेक्टिव and the cultural perspective, but you sort of end up becoming the glorified translator in all these things. They were all wonderful people. I had a wonderful time traveling with them, but I had no role to play in the actual evaluation. So वो भी बहुत कोफ्त हुआ उसमें. फिर finally I, full disclosure, moved to Canada, thinking कि okay चलो ये तो हमारे मुल्क का शायद प्रॉब्लम होगा, maybe on that side I'll have more response towards everything that I've learned. Was very wrong. वहाँ पे भी वो एटीट्यूड था कि it was like a business कि जी हम तो जो हमारी गवर्नमेंट ऑफ कनाडा हमारी क्लाइंट है वो जो हमें कहेगी हम वही करेंगे, and we're really not interested in any sort of cultural context input from Pakistan or elsewhere. So it was a very disappointing situation, and that's when I decided enough is enough. उस वक्त 25 साल तकरीबन गुजर गए थे इस फील्ड में काम कर करके, बहुत सीखा. Tremendous amount of learning, वो मैं deny नहीं कर सकती, but learning isn't everything. आपको change भी देखना जरूरी होता है. So that's when I decided enough is enough, और मैंने ये छोड़ दिया काम. Consultancies में थी मैं उस जमाने में, तो मैंने decide किया कि मैं किसी international donor, international NGO, development sector organization के साथ काम नहीं करूँगी. Then came COVID. तो एक तरह से टाइमिंग भी बहुत अच्छा था, मगर उस जमाने में then I came across these online discussions जो शुरू हो चुकी थी after the anti-racist movement जॉर्ज फ्लॉयड के मर्डर के बाद अमेरिका में, of what is called decolonization. तो आइडिया यही था कि हमारा सारा जो डेवलपमेंट सेक्टर है वो एक कॉलोनियल कॉन्स्ट्रक्ट और कॉलोनियलिज्म से ही भरा हुआ है और भरपूर है. तो हमें इस कॉलोनियल माइंडसेट से निकलना है, और ये डोनर्स जो हैं ये सब हमें रिकॉलोनाइज करना चाहते हैं अपने डोनर फंडिंग के थ्रू, और तो इसीलिए हमें डीकॉलोनाइज करना चाहिए. तो इट वाज एन इंटरेस्टिंग कॉन्सेप्ट. तो उन डिस्कशंस में ऑनलाइन आई गॉट इन्वॉल्व, मगर फिर मैंने रियलाइज किया कि हमें डीकॉलोनाइजेशन इज एक्चुअली नॉट व्हाट दे थिंकिंग. डीकॉलोनाइजेशन अगर हम पार्टीशन को भी देख लें तो एक्चुअल डीकॉलोनाइजेशन वाज अ वेरी वायलेंट प्रोसेस. उससे हमने पार्टीशन में अपने ब्रिटिश कॉलोनियल मास्टर्स को निकाला रीजन से एंड वी गेन इंडिपेंडेंस. यहाँ जो हम डीकॉलोनाइजेशन की बात करते हैं वो इज बेसिकली अ वेरी सॉफ्ट टूल कि नहीं जी डोनर्स जो हैं उनको ज्यादा मजीद कल्चरल कॉन्टेक्स्ट के बारे में सोचना चाहिए. जो हमारे यहाँ अपने लोकल इदारे हैं, NGOs हैं, उनको मौका देना चाहिए कि वो डिसाइड करें कि उनको क्या काम करना है, उनको पैसे किस चीज़ के लिए चाहिए, वो कैसे इस्तेमाल करना चाहते हैं, कौन से मकसद के लिए, and we should take a back seat. But that's not what really colonization is. तो मैं एक तरह से I started speaking against that idea in aid. और मेरा my bottom line is it's either no aid at all, and we as countries need to get our own act together. हम भी तो बड़े colonials हैं. हमारा mindset is no less colonial than the British or the white masters. So we need to get off our own colonial high horse, and we need to start becoming much more self-sufficient in how we manage our own development. Easier said than done in Pakistan or countries like Pakistan. हम अकेले नहीं हैं इसमें. But that's where I stand now. कि मैं काम नहीं करती इस सेक्टर में, मगर मैं कोशिश करती हूँ कि एक तरह से talk about what the other options could be for countries like Pakistan. Academia, I think, is very important. और एक चीज, because this is FAS, it's going to be an up and coming faculty in social sciences. दूसरी इशू ये है कि हम यहाँ पे डेवलपमेंट पढ़ाते नहीं है पाकिस्तान में, और ये बहुत जरूरी है. और जो पढ़ाते भी हैं, अगर पढ़ाते हैं तो हम बाहर की डेवलपमेंट पढ़ाते हैं, कि बाहर के थियोरिस्ट होते हैं, बाहर के राइटर्स होते हैं, बाहर के इंटेलेक्चुअल्स होते हैं, हम अपने एक्सपीरियंसेस को इस्तेमाल नहीं करते हैं. तो डेवलपमेंट स्टडीज एज ए डिसिप्लिन is too westernized, and in Pakistan we need to, I guess, easternize it in a way. So I'm very keen कि हम development studies जो यहाँ जिस तरह से पढ़ाते हैं, जो कम ही पढ़ाते हैं, IBA का एक program है, हबीब यूनिवर्सिटी पढ़ाता है, now FAS here. There needs to be much more local input in how we define development, as opposed to how internationally development is defined. So if you want to have courses in this, academic courses in development, in which you want to introduce the idea of development to young students who don't know anything about it, you need to completely change your mindset, your approach, and your curriculum. For instance, CHS, Community Health Sciences Department के साथ मैंने एक ज़माने में बहुत काम किया था, and that was a fascinating insight for me कि जो doctors आपके जाते थे CHS के साथ to do the community work in medicine for their programs, and the programs that used to come out of CHS that others like our NGOs वगैरह हमने जो collaborate किए थे उनके साथ, they were homegrown. And that's what your doctors needed to see. They needed to see how medicine needs to be practiced in the rural areas or in the low-income urban areas of Pakistan, not how it's practiced somewhere in Dallas or Minnesota or anywhere else. So I think that's the same approach that social sciences in Pakistan needs to take. It needs to be much more, I guess, national-oriented in a way. You can obviously use global examples and global theorists because it has to be broad-based, but I think focus hona chahiye on building a curriculum and building a program that's very, very much talks about Pakistan, South Asia, and how development is viewed and practiced and seen here. So academically, that's what I would say. The book, COVID ke dauran phir ye paida hua. This is a book which basically 2 years in the making. मुझे just out of the blue during these discussions, I was contacted by one of the editors, my co-editors, who is an assistant professor at the University of Ottawa. So she wanted to write something on white saviorism in international development. A white saviorism क्या है? White saviorism exactly वही concept है जो मैं 25 साल से अपने फॉरेन कॉलीग्स के साथ काम कर रही थी, कि मतलब एक गोरा आएगा और हमें अपने परेशानियों से बचा के बिल्कुल सही कर देगा. And that's how we see donors and international NGOs. They are the white saviors for people like us, for non-white people in poor countries. So international development sector का ही पूरा जो एक ethos और message है वो यही है कि हम ही आपको आगे बचा सकते हैं, आप लोगों का तो कोई capacity नहीं है. So we wanted to write something about how pervasive white saviorism, this concept, is in the international development sector. So we got together, हम 3 लोग थे, मैं थी, एक colleague Makerere University जो कैनेडा में थे, and Maika Saundraji जो ऑटावा की थी. The 3 of us हमने plan बनाया. We put together a proposal. We got an independent publisher in Canada who also happens to be ex-AKF, Feroz Manji. he was very active in API Pakistan में भी काम कर चुके हैं. He's retired now, वो एक independent publishing house, बहुत radical publishing house चलाते हैं. So we got started and we got authors from all over the developing world. हमने कोई white authors नहीं इस्तेमाल किए, we just put out a call for papers. और हमने अफ्रीका, एशिया, लैटिन अमेरिका, पाकिस्तान से भी यहाँ पे 2 चैप्टर्स हैं इसमें. We wanted people जो इंटरनेशनल डेवलपमेंट में academics में पढ़ाते थे, जो NGO सेक्टर में काम किया है उन्होंने फॉरेन एजेंसीज के साथ, and people who have managed massive organizations. We wanted them to write about their experiences of how it was for them working with the so-called white development savior. So there are 18 chapters in this book. I have one as well called the Matriarchy Complex, because the white savior is not just a man, there's women are also white saviors. So this book was published in February. Unfortunately, at Pakistan, they're available nahi hai. I'm trying to get a distributor here as well, but it's available online. And Stephen, this is a copy for the AKU library and Press Library. But this is sort of the culmination of where I personally stand in international development. We need to move away from the entire Western rhetoric of what development is, and we need to develop our own. चाहे पाकिस्तानी हो, Ugandan हो, Latin America में, Brazilian हो या whatever, but everybody needs to identify their own development network and their own development concepts and theories and ideas based on our own histories and our own cultures. And that's where I see academia, social sciences in this country going as well. I think that would be a very interesting approach. And to Lagina, because we're very used to teaching foreign concepts. I've also taught a little bit at Habib for a couple of semesters, and it was all about, theorists and writers from the West, who we promote a lot for our students in their readings. But I think we need to change that and have a lot more, our own national flavor in it, regional as well. So that's where I stand now. Completely left the sector behind, and very glad that I have. Or people keep asking me कि आप उन students को क्या advice देंगे जो इस sector को join करना चाह रहे हैं. I said, if you're white, then don't join. Please leave us alone. But if you're from this country, then you need to understand that you need to work for this country. And that means you need to understand this country, your own country. Because a lot of kids, I taught them and they all wanted to know कि मैम हमें बताइए कि इस्लामाबाद में international NGOs कौन से हैं जिसको हम apply कर सकते हैं for a job. So there is this mindset in our young generation also that they all want to work with the international because उनको मौका मिलेगा बाहर जाने का, और they'll be posted to different countries, which is the fascination and the attraction of working in this sector as well, because UN, World Bank, वगैरह. If you manage to get a position with it, you get to travel the world and see the world. But then that's not the point of international development. So this is where I'll end. It's a short story. It's not 25 to 30 minutes. Or maybe it was, but thank you very much.
Please, seat. Oh, thank you so much. Have you signed it?
No, I haven't. Would you like to?
We would, yes,
right.
Afterwards, we'll do that. I think that was fascinating. I think I go full circle on these things. I have been involved in development for several decades, but always from the very comfortable position of an academic position. I've never had to do the contract consultancy. It's always been an addition to me. So you I think rightly point to that kind of neo-colonialism, decolonization, whatever term we want to say it, where it seems to be very clear that when USAID or DFID is investing, it is in America's interests, it's in Britain's interests. I wonder if you see a difference between the CPEC or the Gulf investment. Do you see that also as a form of colonization, or do you think there's a difference between a kind of, in a sense, not that the Gulf is global South, but that global South to global South donor, as opposed to global North to global South donor?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because that is now the second part of this discussion. So the global south idea. So, we're now contradicting that term as well. There's no such thing as global south and global north. There's the word, right? And like you said, the Gulf is technically, by this definition, part of the global south, but it's one of the richest countries in the world. So how can it be? Then that's geographically you're looking at it, which is completely skewed. So there's that discussion that, what is south to south as well. So the other part is that, yes, there is also now this trend of what we call the new emerging donors. So the NEDs. And this is the OECD's come up with this. And in new emerging donors, you have the Gulf countries, you've got Turkey, you've got China, you've got a country like Cyprus, for God's sake, that is, and these are not your traditional donors like the US, UK, but they do still provide a lot of aid in different ways to other countries. Just like countries in Africa, for instance, or Latin America, much lower down the scale because they don't have development agencies like USAID or FCDO, but they still have government-to-government bilateral ties that provide this aid. So that again then brings the question that, they are also very powerful countries, for instance. So are you classifying this as aid or are you classifying this as something different? So that is also why I think the entire discussion, the aid sector is very redundant because it leaves out so many of the new geopolitical power struggles that we're going, and it's got a very traditional view of what they see as a donor, not realizing that China through CPEC or Belt and Road is now one of the neo-colonial powers coming up. So is the Gulf. So
does that, sorry to interrupt, does that concern you as much?
It does.
It does.
It does. It does. Because it's all about power, right? And power comes from money. Who has the most money? So it's the money that dictates the decision making. And in countries like the US and UK, we say they're democratic, right? At least that's the impression that they give us. But countries like the Gulf and China are not democratic. So they will dictate and you will do what they say. So they don't have this aura of development cooperation, as we put it, right? Even though they may also try and project that aura, but they don't have development agencies per se. So that is worrying because it is this new trend of new emerging donors that is as powerful as what the original Western donors were. So in a way, it's a replacement.
So one of the arguments I've heard about why CPEC is better than Western aid is that the Chinese, for all of their flaws, don't really care how countries run themselves. So if you want to commit human rights violations, they're happy, they're fine, they'll leave you to your own. And the US, for all of its flaws, actually does pay lip service to caring about human rights. So if you're an authoritarian regime, CPEC is your go-to place. If you're trying to force through human rights, then you take Western aid. They're both problematic, but the CPEC one lends itself more to the authoritarian regime that doesn't want to be challenged on any human rights abuses within their borders. I'm just curious whether you would agree with that analysis or whether you think actually no, CPEC, China is actually a better donor for some other reason.
I don't think there is a such thing as a better donor right now to start with. Everybody has their agendas. Even countries that take the money like ours, we have our own agenda as to who we're taking the money from, for what purpose. So the point that I always try and make is that the donors will have their agenda, whether they're China and CPEC or whether they're the US and USAID, authoritarian or so-called democratic. The issue is, what do we want as a nation? And we've always put that on the side, primarily because of our own problems and our own political setup or lack of it. So the issue is, if our country doesn't have that civic space to fight for human rights, then as a state, yes, obviously we will go to whoever lets us do what we want. But the question is, it's the space we need to start making within ourselves and within our own communities to start saying, okay, we don't want money from CPEC, China, we don't want money from the US. We want you to pay for the services that you are supposed to have been paying for day one, which you don't. You don't give us health services, you don't give us education, you don't give us clean drinking water, you're stealing our land from us. None of this is by donor decree. This is our own politicians and government behaving. And this is where I feel that the discussions on aid and donors completely bypasses this discussion. It's all about, okay, should we give it, should we not give it, should we be authoritarian, should we be democratic? The idea is countries themselves are losing sight of their own direction. And that's where we need to think inwardly. So for me, we need to get ourselves on track before we can think. I mean, easier said than done, I know.
Sure,
But
absolutely. But given that, how would you deal with the remittances that come in, which by some estimates may be more than 50% of GDP, which surely must be a potential source of funding for doing exactly what you're talking about. How do you harness that in a way that the state can actually direct some of the development?
so here's the thing with remittances, and I think remittances is also very misunderstood and a very politically motivated sort of angle. And the World Bank started this. Again, all the Western donors' fault. The fact that remittances are much higher than FDI in a country. So they're actually you don't need aid, you have remittances coming into countries. So I've done a lot of work on labor migration from Pakistan to the Gulf, and the remittances are part of that. The issue with remittances is most remittances that come in from your 8 million plus workers in the Gulf states are personal remittances.
Sure.
A lot of them are not recorded because they used to at least come in through the Hawala system. And these are all for personal use in families and households, in communities, etc. They don't technically go into the state coffers. They don't technically have to pay income tax on them. So a lot of this money is up to the personal use of the worker and their family. So that brings again a difference in the sense that, okay, so your personal household income may be increasing, your standard of living may increase in a particular, like we've seen in Gujarat and a lot of other provinces in Punjab, where there's a very high rate. We've seen how growth has shot up, mostly through like hideous pastry-like mansions coming up, because that's where the money is going. People are sending money and building new houses for themselves. But it's not the money that's going into development funding for the country.
Would you not consider, so going to a place like Newport, it has actually a fairly thriving middle-class sector as a consequence of those remittances. So one could look at that, forget the state, this is a form of development. This is a form of economic stimulation.
It's one form of it, but
Yeah.
it's limited in the sense it depends on how many people you have abroad sending money.
Yeah.
The entire half the country is not going to go abroad and send money, right? Right now we have 9 million plus overseas Pakistanis, and not those overseas Pakistanis, the one who yell about PTI and Nawaz Sharif, but workers.
You're going to get us shut down before we even start.
Oh,
Please go ahead.
I'm
Please
just
go ahead.
tired of being quiet now, But it's the workers in the Gulf primarily, right?
Yeah.
They're the ones who are sending the money home, and
Sure.
the amount they can send home is limited now based on the countries they're working in, and a lot of the Gulf countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, etc., are reducing the amount of pay. There's a lot of exploitation going on that Pakistan doesn't address, and I was writing a draft policy for the Ministry of Immigration and Overseas Pakistanis, and the whole issue in that is that you are not providing your overseas workers with the protections that they are legally entitled to. You're letting them get exploited, yet you use their remittances as your buffer to say, oh look, so they bring in all this money and the country can flourish. So it is one form of development, but it's a small one. But the point is that there need to be many such examples that we can generate revenue via, and then be a little more self-sufficient.
So I'm somewhat puzzled where the money would come from if we're saying no China, no Europe, no US, and actually these remittances, we're not going to count them because they're too piecemeal. So where does the money come from?
I mean, there's now some work being done on that, again, internationally, and no, remittances is one of them,
Yeah, okay.
There's also diaspora contributions. Like, AKUH is one of the biggest examples of AKUH alumni going abroad and then, as foreign diaspora, then giving back to Pakistan. So, that is a very important part of.
Do you not know about their agenda?
Everybody has an agenda at the end of the day. It just
Yes.
depends on how we as a receiving country
Okay.
manage it. I guess.
And do you think it would be easier to manage the overseas Pakistani donations? Certainly in Aga Khan University and AKF, AKDN writ large, we benefit enormously from donations of the Ismaili community broadly, but Pakistanis in particular in Canada. They have particular ideas about, for example, women's empowerment. And so we happen to agree with those. Right? I wouldn't be here if I didn't. But that in there's an alignment, but that may not be entirely aligned with some of the people that we're trying to help.
No, absolutely. And those are some of the obstacles and barriers that, one is coming up with when you're trying to think of alternatives, right? Because for decades, we've been in a part of a system that has really so messed up now. There's no magic wand that can overnight change it, right? So one of the barriers is exactly this, that there's a dichotomy between what the country should ideally be moving towards and what the country itself wants to move towards, right? How do you reconcile those two paths, which is something we all need to sit and think about as well. But in forms of revenue, well, the main form of revenue, which a lot of people have been going about, is taxation. I mean, we have no taxation in this country. For any country, that is the key form of development revenue coming in. So you've got that. You've got revenue that could come in from state in public institutions, which are all dead and not performing at all. So we're not making revenue of anything. All our public and state institutions are going bankrupt. You have revenue that you can come in from agriculture, from industrialization, but we don't have the proper regulations. We're discouraging new businesses from coming up because of all the tight regulations that we're trying to now put in place because we messed things up 30, 40, 50 years ago so badly. We're reeling from that. So the revenue, and of course, there's our budget, which shows that we have a lot of money, right? But we're just not allocating it in the right way. So I don't think there's a lack of money, to be very honest with you. I think it's the allocation of the funds we have, and it's just making sure that we take the most utility out of our own investment. So until we have our taxation in place, until we have regulations for corporations, corporate tax, things like this in place, and how we allocate to social services, for instance, because we have some of the lowest social service allocations in national budget anywhere in the world.
Sure.
It's quite simple to do. It's a matter of reallocating resources. So I don't think there's no money. I think there's quite a lot of money. And of course, where there is a shortfall, then you go to donors. Doesn't mean you completely end them, but you need to be, independent before you can go to a donor and say, I need money. At least that's my thinking.
Okay. Please do raise your hand if you want to say something. If you want to ask a question, Hussein, please.
This savior thing that you talk about, how similar do you see it to, say, the Christian missionaries or the Muslim missionaries, going into a new land and saying, Padho kalma and, you're saved. Is there a similarity over there?
It started from that actually. In our book, we've actually got somebody who does point to that it was the religious missionaries who brought the idea of saviorism, to these new lands. And the whole idea started millennia ago when North America was colonized by Columbus, because the indigenous populations of that continent were wiped out and they brought Christianity and instead. And we lost all this indigenous knowledge and indigenous people. Shuru wahi se hua. That's where the whole idea of white saviorism actually as a concept does emerge, because it was the white Christian missionary who brought civilization and a civilized way of thinking about God to countries that it thought was uncivilized. So that's definitely the start of it. I can't say much about the Muslim missionaries, but we do talk in our book about the fact that it's not just white saviors, we've got a lot of brown and black saviors as well. There's a chapter on brown saviors as well. Ki hum jaise log jo hain in South Asia, we also have this Gora complex. So we also imbibe the same amount of power where we, to our people who are perhaps of a lower stature than us, and we see this every day in Pakistan, that we exercise our power, that no, we have the money, so we are saving your life by giving you this quality amount of salary or whatever. So it's not just the white savior, it's the attitude of saviorism that, you know, somebody is always there better than the other and only they can save the other ones.
Can I not defend saviorism, but would you kind of accept that actually at the base of much of that is not malice, but actually good intent? That people, you know, I mean, I think about all of the young volunteers I've seen with Oxfam over the years. I think they're all guilty of white saviorism. I think every single one of them. But I also think that it comes from a very good place, that they genuinely do think what they're doing. It's a little bit like when I, at the risk of irritating my medical colleagues, when I listen to medics, they know what's right for us, right? Stop smoking, lose weight, exercise. They're convinced of it. And somebody comes up and says, but I like smoking. I don't really like exercise. I enjoy my cigarette and watch my television, having my, you know, my corn chips and fatty foods. So leave me alone and let me die 20 years earlier. And the medics are apoplectic because their heart is in the right place. They genuinely want to do something good. But I actually would defend that the sort of the smoking obese person's right to die younger, right? If that's really where they want to go, let them do it. And that's where I found a lot of the white saviors is they're not evil people, but their arrogance actually does some damage, but it comes from a good place. So how would you talked about nationalizing and indigenizing in a sense, the curriculum. Could that be a part of taking that actually quite altruistic, benevolent spirit of the white savior and channeling it in a way that rubs off some of the arrogance? Is that possible? Or do you think that, you said white people don't apply, white people stay home. Do you think that's just the way it has to be?
See, when I say that, you're absolutely right. It comes from arrogance. I don't know if it always comes from a good place. I think that is a bit of a gray area because what the savior, white or any other color, may think is good, like you just gave the example of the smoking, the one there to be saved may not think it's a good idea, right? So I think that idea is a little, you can contest that I don't know if it's always, who is it a good place for, right? I was in the Netherlands last year speaking at a decolonized global health conference, and they have a program at their university where they send a whole bunch of medical students all over the world to do their medical practicum, mostly in countries of Africa, but also Latin America. And that's causing a lot of problems because these are these young white Dutch students, medical students, who are going into environments they know nothing about, but they are imposing their way of medical practicing on small little community hospitals in, you know, Sierra Leone or wherever, where they are learning and imposing their own techniques. And apparently there were a lot of complaints from many hospitals and doctors saying these kids are messing with our system. We don't have the best system. So again, the idea is good because you wanted those medical students to learn about other countries, but instead those medical students are going in, we're here to teach you how a surgery is done. And they're students, they're not even medical doctors yet, they're not graduate. And so that idea that we are there because we know better, we know medicine better than anyone else. So I don't know if the intention is always good, and if it is, there's a difference between who is thinking that and where it's coming from, at least that I see. But just one more thing I'd like to say is the idea of altruism and philanthropy and charity. I think countries like Pakistan are very heavily rooted in that. We've always been a very charitable nation. You know, we've got EG, we've got Salim, we've got so many charitable institutions that are there at the first scene of any disaster. We're constantly donating, giving zakat, giving alms. So there's a difference between that sort of charity and philanthropy and altruism. And then there is the more formal part, which is now what aid is. And that's not exactly philanthropy or charity, no matter how much you try to say it's good, it's to do good. So I think that's the difference we need to make.
But there, at the level of the donor, I think we just have to be honest and say, you know, DFID is a part of soft power of the British government, and it's an illusion to think anything else. USAID is the same. It's very clear USAID is in part born out of the Cold War, and it was very much an exercise of soft power. But the individuals who work for, say, the Peace Corps or USAID, I think their philanthropy, I would think, is comparable to the philanthropy of Pakistan. I mean, look at the way Pakistan has accepted refugees. Contrast that with the way Europe Britain is letting them drown. So I think there's no question Pakistan's generosity and philanthropy is streets ahead of most of Europe. But I see that same spirit in those young volunteers, which is separate from the donor, because I think the donor rationale and the donor reason for giving is extraordinarily self-serving. But the people on the ground strike me as different. And this is where I'm not saying you're wrong at all.
No, absolutely.
But the white saviorism seems to me, I wonder if what is the consequence of that on development, on those people who want to help? Where do they go? What do they do?
That's just it, and those are the questions I keep getting from when I speak to students in universities overseas. They ask, we want to get into this sector, how do we do it if this is what you're saying, we are actually doing more damage than good? And the first thing in that is that you have to first understand what it is you want to go do. Do you want to go and help, quote unquote, the poor? Because you think you're better off than them and you're the only one who can do it and they can't, and unless I go? Or do you want to actually go out and learn about how other people live, stay in the shadows, get observed? Or do you want just a cushy job in an international agency that's going to make you travel the world, make a lot of money and live, lavishly? And they want to do all three, especially the last one. But it's a tough choice for them as well. And the reason I tell them don't go into it is because I think they're still very young. And what happens is in the North and in the West, from that age, they're already inculcated with the mindset that you have a lot more, you are better than others, you do have access to more resources, and everybody else in the rest of the world doesn't. So it's not a very balanced approach to what the rest of the world is. Like, it's giving no agency to other countries at all. Which is why I think there is a confusion in their minds about this whole doing good. They think they're doing good, but it's probably not with the right approach and mindset.
So if we pick on Britain for a moment, many of the young people who are able to go into development come from the independent school sector. They've gone to the Oxbridge, like pre-92 universities, and they are very privileged. They have that sense that, not that they're bad people, but they are privileged and they've grown up with that. Would it make a difference if we selected from the comprehensives, from the working class kids, the kids who went to the post-92 universities, the former polytechnics, those kids who did not grow up with a sense of privilege, but in fact, rather the opposite, grew up feeling very much the way you're describing Pakistanis, that they were the exploited, oppressed class within their own country, so that they would not have a sense that they know the best way for the world, but they would share that understanding of having been told what is best by others.
I think everybody should get an opportunity. I don't think it's a matter of choosing from a particular category.
Okay.
Whether you're rich, whether you're not particularly well off, whether you're less privileged or more privileged. Obviously that has something to do with the way you think. But if you want to work in development, anyone coming from any background needs to put all their preconceived notions at the back, leave it behind, and come into the sector knowing that not everybody is going to be like you, and that not every thing you want to happen will happen, and that you're going to have to learn, observe, and understand who you want to work with and help, and let them make those decisions and be open enough to do that. And that there's no background that should stop you from doing that, whether you're coming from a rich elite, AKU graduate, or you're coming from, Sindh University, Jamshoro, or whatever. At the end of the day,
all good universities.
Yes. Or everybody should be looking at the idea of development in the same way.
I'm gonna ask, is there any comment or questions online? Yes. So can we make sure that we don't neglect our online audience? If you hand this to me, I can read it out. Thank you. So, so there's a question here. I'll read out the name of the question so you know who's asking. Murad Khan said, you said there is money in countries like Pakistan, but it's not allocated properly. Would you agree that countries that are donors are countries who have good governance systems and countries like Pakistan don't? Can you comment on this, and what can we learn from donor countries, democratic like the US, UK, or autocratic like China or Gulf?
I think we can learn a lot from each other if we give each other the opportunity to learn from. Yes, we definitely have a bad governance problem in Pakistan, which is why the allocations don't exactly work the way they should. I don't know if the governance is, it's definitely better in the US, the UK, or most of the Western world, but I don't know if it is the best governance either. Because as you say, the UK, for instance, is changing a lot. Their governance leaves a lot to be desired now in the last few years, the way that we've seen their policies changing. Same in the US, same in Europe, for instance. So I think governance is changing everywhere, some places for the better, some places for the worse. And I think that's what we need to keep our eye on to be able to learn and see, okay, for instance, let's take the refugee issue, for instance. I mean, we don't want to go the way the UK is going, and that's what we need to learn. We need to learn that we cannot treat refugees the way they are wanting to treat them. We look at the US foreign policy and we say, no, that's not the way we want to go, because we do not want to go start invading other countries and sort of taking up. So in terms of learning how to govern, I think we all have something to learn from each other. It's just that I think there's this arrogance here where we feel we have nothing left to learn from anyone, which is why then we refuse to move forward. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think we all need to take a back seat, look inwards, see what other countries are doing, what direction they're going in, and then see, is that the same direction we want to go in or not?
I mean, since the subject of refugees has come up, do you think that is there a role for the kind of white saviorism in humanitarian aid as opposed to development? Humanitarian, of course, is much shorter term, and in the aftermath of a natural disaster, arguably, you don't have community coherence to go to speak to people. It is a matter of providing, as we did following the floods, tent cities and medicine, and there very little consultation goes on. Somebody, in this case in AKU, had a sense of what people needed, and we delivered it. So do you think that, I think the white saviorism probably doesn't belong anywhere. We don't need people to have that kind of mindset, but that sense of development, I'm with you 100%, that must be consultative and it must be with consent. Humanitarian aid, on the other hand, I sometimes wonder whether people like me aren't needed.
Yeah, I mean, there's the same discussions going on in the humanitarian sector right now as well. Exactly the same. I mean, we should decolonize humanitarianism as well. And the issue there is it still exists white saviorism, because majority of your largest humanitarian aid providers, whether they're the Red Cross or whether they're the EU who funds all these organizations, are all white again. So they're coming in with exactly the same mindset that they're coming into development aid with. The issue in humanitarianism is that you've got a lot of on-ground humanitarians and first responders in countries of disaster that are completely sidelined when a disaster happens. Yet they are the first ones to reach on the scene. And I always use the example of EB Foundation, for instance. They're the first to reach on the scene of any disaster. And then suddenly the UN comes in and they sideline everybody and they set up their own. And I've been through this in the 2005 earthquake. This is what happened. All the UN agencies and the Red Cross and what have you came in, and they sidelined every single Pakistani humanitarian agency and said, no, we're going to do our own thing. And that was white saviorism, because we know how to do it. Let us do our job. So exactly the same discussion does apply to humanitarianism as well.
Okay. We have a question from Kaisar Iqbal. How do you see the future of the development sector in Pakistan, particularly after CPEC, and with the shrinking space for the development sector?
That's a very good question, because that's the whole issue in Pakistan, this shrinking civic space. And we've seen that happen because of the sort of government control and regulation of foreign funding coming in. So a lot of NGOs, which is a good thing for me, like, the Save the Children and national NGOs have all been told to clear out, which I think is a wonderful thing in the sense that it leaves a gap, but it leaves a gap for a lot of Pakistani organizations that perhaps come in and do the work. But the thing is, there's so much pressure now on civil society in Pakistan, which is now, I think, becoming very activist oriented, which is fantastic. I think that's exactly what we need. But it's a very, very tough space to work in because you can just see how much resistance there is to that sort of change, those sort of civic movements, social movements coming in. You've got the Aurat March, you've got Karachi Bachao Tehreek, you've got a lot of these organizations that are coming in and really, really fighting the real fight for the real issues. And I've spoken to a couple of donors about it, and a lot of them don't even want to go towards these issues. So I said, then what's the point of you coming in to try and save, right? If you don't want to touch the real issues that are important to this country, then what exactly are you here for? But those are issues we just don't want to go near because they are touchy issues. They are receiving a lot of resistance from our own quarters, and so it's a very geopolitical, international, national sort of a tussle that's going on. But he's very right about this. He's very right about the shrinking civic space, which is happening in Pakistan. But I have hope for that because I'm seeing a lot of activity over the last few years, which a lot of people are being very brave, I think, to come out and to talk about issues and to make noise about it. And I think that's exactly what we need to move in any direction at the moment.
Question, please.
So the question kind of naturally flows from where you have left right here. I was going to ask about when these formal development sectors and NGOs go to the grassroots levels. What happens is there is a formal system, and where they have worked, people like me, we as a kid have seen AKD and their initiatives and kind of grown into that concept of when I grow up, I'm going to work for the development sector with a clear vision. But then we come up with literature like yours or say Robert Chambers, whose development counts, poverty, politics and power, and how it's utilized, just the ones you summarized. And Stephen also gave reference to, how the agenda is being influenced. For example, even if I speak for AKDN or AKF, the ones who are the major donors, we might agree to what their concepts are, but then at the end of the day, there are hierarchies which I may not agree to at a grassroots level. Now that has created an apolitical kind of, implication, the formal sector there. Now my question here is, if we say that, we don't need those big donors, and then we have some of the Pakistani based formal sectors, or at least who have existed for 50 years, 60 years, and they have their own implications of making people apolitical due to several reasons. They have to work in a framework. Then how does that development agenda progresses? You said there is a shrinking space for the civil society as well. Where do we start then? How do we move forward then? I don't know, it's a very we have three junctions: formal sector coming in, we are trying to stop that, the radical left or the ones who speak politically, the state tries to take them down. So where do we stand? How do we start?
I mean, it's a great question, and I don't have an answer for that right now, because there are no easy answers to any of this right now. All I know is that there has to be some shift in our own interpretation of what we see happening. I'll just give the example, and this is, maybe it's not related to your question, maybe it is. Islamabad right now is full of, I hate to say it, but third-rate consultancy firms that are taking donor money to do reporting, to do project implementation of word by word of what a donor wants done. And they're not even blinking an eye. They're not even questioning it. मुझे phone calls आते हैं कि जी ये त्योहार आया है, consultant चाहिए, 6 महीनों का काम है, please कर दो. And I'm sorry, but I mean this TOR is नहीं, please, कल तक हमें इनको जवाब देना है, आप बस कर दो. And this is how they work. And this is where our money is going, into these products which are so superficial and which are so unrelated to our actual needs. But yet this is our mindset. This is where so many people are going because there's money and it's a business for them. So what do you do with that then? That sort of mindset. Civics, and they're not into activism. They're into just, we need the donors' money, we need to get a job done. We really don't care whether this is helping Pakistan or not. So you're also fighting with that sort of a mindset. And where do we start? I don't know, but I think the activism is the right place to start. I think individuals need, because the state is a very difficult being in any part of the world. I mean, you can't change USAID or FCDO's mindset either, the UK government or the American governments, right? It's just, at this point, it's better not to go there. But if the people decide there has to be some change, I know it's cliche, it sounds very cliche, but I would say start there. But I'm also trying to figure that out right now, because we haven't even spoken about these discussions for so long. They're just starting these conversations. That first, I think we need to talk a lot more about this and these ideas that we may have or we may not have. Then we'll be able to perhaps move forward a little bit. But I don't have an answer to any of that right now. I don't know where to start because it's all such a mess. It's hard to.
Got an excellent question in the chat box. Can you give examples of countries that have refused aid and progressed other than China and
I was
India?
just going to say, yes, everybody asked that question, and that's exactly what everybody says, other than China and India, right?
Yes.
Actually, no, that's a very good question, and there aren't any examples that I can give you. There are some countries that, for instance, Turkey used to take a lot of aid as well, and they still do, but they have politically also been trying to distance themselves from the overall environment. But to date, there has not really been a country that has said no to aid in its entirety, other than India and China. And that makes you wonder why, right? India is still getting a bit of aid. It's not completely said no to aid. It still has all the major donors, still operate out of India, but the levels of aid have come down drastically. But no country has ever done that, because I don't think that's something that ever enters their mind, because they're so used to the money just pouring in. That they just can't. So no, good question, but no, there isn't any.
We are running short on time. Sen, you've got another question?
Yeah.
Comment?
You talked about the AKRSP as a separate thing, or you did not. You know, I was not too sure.
No, because AKRSP I've personally seen myself, and it really was one of those outstanding pieces of work that you don't get to see. The only thing I feel now is that AKRSP has been a model for too long for the AKDN network. And I've lost track of it for many years. And it was a very specific and particular model of rural development and infrastructure. We tried to replicate the RSP models around the country. It didn't work as well as it did with the RSP. But I just think that really is a fabulous example and has always been a sort of a gold standard for rural development.
And Urangi pilot project?
Urangi also, yes, absolutely. But like, I guess AKRSP as well, Urangi has also suffered a lack of leadership post, urbanization in Karachi hasn't been able to keep up. So I think what the gold standard it achieved in those days is sort of losing now. So they remain gold standards for that era, perhaps not now.
Please.
I had a comment on this, which is you have to punish when something is wrong. There's nothing without accountability. And I've been in India. I have seen how things function there. And right now, as you see what's happening, is an extreme reaction. And within our country itself, it's not that there's been a decolonization. The people who want to break away from those things have taken over the colonialist attitude. We know better, you don't know. And there's no shortcut without an accountability there. And people have to pay a price. This poor girl who was murdered when you're talking Warangi and all that. Where's the punishment? And there has to be a law, and I think there's no shortcut to giving education to the lowest level first. And that should certainly be free. In Turkey, they have done it for quite a while. And when it comes to college, medicine, etc., they have to work for the country for 4 or 5 years. If they don't, they have to pay back. Sounds reasonable to me.
Right, no,
And
absolutely.
I think AKU certainly offers scholarships and aid to people. And that can't all be charity. It cannot be given, you have to do something in return. You can't get a lovely master's and a PhD in nursing and go outside and make money. You have to give some of that back. And I don't think everyone is born with a conscience, but they can certainly learn that having a conscience will help. So I think there is a way out without saying we won't take money from anyone. What has happened in India since long ago with Indira Gandhi, they just decided they're going to let the poor go and let a certain class above start getting educated. If you can't find these crystal glasses somewhere, you don't buy them, you make it yourself. And
100%
there has to be,
key.
and they can be very heartless. They don't have the Islamic feeling of giving. Every Ramzan you see here, people are feeding them on the streets. What happened to the rest of the months of the year? You know, it's, you can't deny when you're doing something wrong. And we have enough rich people here to contribute, pay their taxes. I think there's no shortcut to that. You can't have political infighting. It's,
100% accountability
No.
is the key.
I'm too old in there to do anything.
Not at all.
But you certainly have ideas, you can, you have the experience of it. That you know there's an attraction, you have admitted to getting into those organizations that give you a good salary. You see what's happening in France? They are fighting when the money goes for the comfort only of the elderly, at retirement age. I think the Canadian is good where they say you retire when you think you can't do anymore.
Or you don't retire at all. That's the other extreme in Canada.
If I could, we're nearly out of time, but I would like to finish with, I would be remiss if I didn't name drop one of the best development people I know. My former student, Hamza Hassan, works for UNDP. And I think what he's done with youth engagement programs, particularly in areas like Themrise Khan, is actually phenomenal. And he's used the agenda of the UN. He's used the ideology of the UN as leverage to do something that aligns with his own personal morals. And I think that actually sits very well in the icon. So I think, I mean, I take everything you say actually very seriously, but I wonder if the UN, if there are not within that good people like him who actually can use that.
100%.
Yes.
And it's not all bad. I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. But it's a matter of exactly like you say, what do you do with it?
Yeah.
Do you take the benefit out of it for the larger society as a whole or just for yourself,
Yeah.
right? And then modify, adapt those ideas to who you feel needs them most, as opposed to who, for instance, the UN might. So absolutely, there are definitely good people there. The sad thing is that there's a risk that the system might suck you in so deeply that you can't get out.
Yeah, no, that, I think that's a danger of many organizations. It's easy to lose sight of why one started in the first place. Themrise, thank you so much. Start of a conversation. We're going to bring you back. I want to do this with the students because this is the kind of conversation I wish I had heard as a student. It wouldn't have put me off going into development, quite honestly. It really wouldn't have. But what it would have done is open my eyes to some of the, the Ferguson and the Gupta kind of critiques, which I encountered later. But at the start, I think wanting to help other people is actually a good thing that we should encourage.
Yes, absolutely.
But we do need to make sure that it is genuinely helpful and with consent.
Yeah.
That's very important. So thank you so much. We are going to continue the informal conversation over, I think we have samosas. We always have samosas. But before we go over there, Themrise, we are very grateful for you taking the time, because we know you are globetrotting and going from here to there.
Just this year.
Just this year.
Thank you so much.
And we
That's
have,
really lovely.
yes, just a few
Thank
tokens
you.
of our esteem
Thank you.
I would like to.
over here.
I've never had a picture like this taken.
Oh, have you not?
So many of them, I've never had one taken of me doing the, the.
Yes, well, now you do.
You guys move a bit.
Oh, right. That was very good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Actually,
Thank you very much.
once you have got eyes closed, I have to stay reading.
No, okay. So stop closing my eyes.
One more. Then it's an eye.
Thank you. And some,
Oh, this is wonderful. Thank you so much.
so can we get a picture of
Thank you
Shireen
very
giving you
much.
flowers?
No.
With
Oh,
the-
great. Yes.
Yeah, Shireen and I go back a long way.
Ready? Thank you.
Thank you very much.